And at least two of their books have shaken badly my own comfortable feeling that the Warren Report had disposed of this sad matter. There are literally hundreds of statements of this kind that one can find now. So, with that preamble, here is Mr. Jim Garrison. Nice to see you, Mr. Garrison. I have studied your book very carefully, and I've underlined, I should say, a very remarkable piece of work, however judged. And it might be interesting, before we put our first question to you, if we take a little audience survey here. There's nothing official about it, obviously. We only have, I think, about 250 people in the room here at the moment. Would those of you who think that the Warren Report leaves something to be desired, that the whole truth, in other words, about the Kennedy assassination has not as yet really come out and was not represented in the Warren Report, will those of you with that kind of reservation about the Warren Report please applaud?
Steve? Yes. Lewis Harris is a friend of mine, although I don't want you to think he's subjective because of that. The pollster told me that approximately 91% of the American people do not believe the Warren Report, and the 9% of us who do believe in it, I'm in that group, we get together once a year and have a party. Anyway, to continue, you were saying...
It is interesting that almost all of our audience has some reservations. However, let's take the other side of the coin here just briefly before letting Mr. Garrison speak. Well, those of you who think that the Warren Report is about as reliable as any human document can get, you had complete faith in it, in other words, would you applaud? It's interesting. Only about 4 people in our audience. Does that somehow encourage you, Mr. Garrison, in your own theories?
Well, yes, Steve, it certainly does. It confirms my belief in the common sense of the American people. And their awareness that many things were hidden in the federal investigation, and particularly in the Warren Report. And of course, that is partly the subject of my book. Actually, as you know, having read it, my book has a broader topic. It really involves how we got in Vietnam, the American crisis today in Vietnam, and the relationship of John Kennedy's assassination to our involvement in the Vietnam War.
How did you personally become involved in the case of the Kennedy assassination?
Well, that was, it seems like a century ago, really, but because the federal government hasn't been too cooperative, and I've been over so many hurdles in the last 3 years. Actually, we stumbled across one of the people involved in the assassination within 72 hours by accident. New Orleans had been used to condition Oswald and set him up as a scapegoat to create a believable background of him as a leftist, and also to Cubanize him, to give him a Cuban background for reasons I'll explain later. And my office has had a custom for some years. I've been in office 8 years, this is the 9th. When there were unusual murders, we've usually met on the weekend, and even if it was somewhere else in the nation, and if there was any indication that New Orleans was involved, we'd go through our files and see if there was some kind of lead that might help that other office. For example, in the case of the Chicago murder of the 8 nurses, since a seaman was apparently involved because of the types of knots and the ropes, we met on the weekend and went over all charges we had over the years against seamen. This particular occasion, we happened to stumble across, in our weekend meeting, the weekend that John Kennedy was killed, we stumbled across an associate of his that had been with him constantly in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, named David Ferry.
An associate of...
Lee Oswald.
Yes.
Yes. And, of course, by that time, Oswald had been killed. All this happening in a matter of 48 hours or so. So I sent my staff out to Dave Ferry's house so we could question him. And we found he was gone. We found an apartment full of arms and guns and this sort of material, but he was gone and gone to Texas and hadn't returned yet. Well, under the circumstances, we were increasingly interested then, so we set up a stakeout, and when he returned from Texas, we got him and questioned him and asked him why he went to Texas that weekend. And his explanation was that he'd gone to Texas the weekend of the assassination in order to go ice skating, because he hadn't been ice skating for years. And of course, I have no feeling against ice skating as a form of relaxation. But under the circumstances, I felt that he had driven 8 hours through one of the worst thunderstorms in years. I felt that driving through a thunderstorm for 8 hours to go ice skating in order to arrive in a state where the President of the United States was killed was a rather unusual circumstance.
Can one ice skate in New Orleans?
I don't think you can ice skate in New Orleans, but I think there are places closer than Texas to go ice skating. And so we felt that that was a rather inadequate explanation of the circumstances, because we had the President of the United States had just been killed, and then a police officer had been killed in Dallas, and then the man who allegedly killed the President had been killed, and all of a sudden, when we encounter the name of an associate of Lee Oswald's, we find that he'd just come back from Texas where he'd been ice skating. So we contacted the FBI and arrested him to turn him over to the FBI. And to our astonishment, the FBI showed no interest at all. And we pressed by actually calling the Dallas police, who contacted the FBI there. And so the FBI finally reluctantly took a statement from him, which was more or less dictated by David Ferry himself. That's the man's name.
Is that statement available now?
Oh, yes, of course. It's available. I've described it to some degree in the book because it's a self-serving statement. But that's how I got involved. But at that point, when the federal agents I talked to, I said, "My God, do you mean to say that you accepted this explanation as legitimate, that you still feel that this is a meaningless assassination, that the trip was justified and of no significance?" And the answer was, "We're satisfied that it was Oswald and Oswald alone." So, of course, I was much more naive about the federal government at the time than I am now. Steve, the scene shifts because for 3 years we did nothing about it. Looking back, I can see that it was naivety on my part. But all my life in school, I had, like all other Americans, taken the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And at the beginning of every football game, I had participated in the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. And it really never occurred to me that the federal government would be involved in any way in the assassination of its own president, or that it would lie and cover it up. And I happened to be in New York 3 years afterwards with Senator Russell Long from Louisiana, and we were discussing the assassination casually when he suddenly commented that he wasn't satisfied with the results, that it didn't fit, and it didn't make sense. And of course, I was astonished because he was a United States Senator, just fresh from Washington, visiting New York, telling me that he was not satisfied with the results. So for the first time, I began to dig into it. I went through the entire 26 volumes of the Warren Report, and which takes an awful long time. If you have the time, you might try it. But it's a physical feat more than an intellectual one, because most of it really is irrelevant. and misleading. It's essentially the compilation, the 26 volumes, is a domestic intelligence accomplishment. We found out that it was very clear that the President of the United States had been shot from the front, and that this had been clear on the first day of the assassination. And then we found out further that the Warren Commission had failed to call the witnesses who saw most clearly what had happened, and called only those who did not know what had happened.
There are many, Mr. Garrison, who feel that the President was shot from the back and from the front. Do you distinguish yourself from that group and you say he was shot solely by people in the front of his car?
No, he was shot by both front and back, Steve. The doctors at Parkland Hospital, the best authorities on that question, the civilian doctors, testified and stated immediately afterwards that he had been shot both from the front and the back. The cause of death certificate, which was filed early that afternoon by Dr. John McClellan of Dallas, filed before the federal government could begin to set up its tableau and before its domestic intelligence could confuse the picture and begin to send out material through the media to confuse you and confuse me. The cause of death was indicated as a gunshot wound of the temple. So there was no question about that. And there was no question about the fact that 3 out of 4 people in Dealey Plaza had heard most of the firing from the grassy knoll in front. This was all on the very first day.
I can still remember, along with the shock of hearing the first news announcement on the radio that terrible day, that the announcement included a reference to gunfire from the grassy knoll. Whether that is the case or not, I have no way of knowing, but it was part of the initial radio report.
Jim, do you think it would be appropriate here to mention Commander Hume's testimony during the trial?
Gary, this is wonderful. I'm so glad that you have this here because it deserves to be taken out of the archive and put in public display. This is extremely important. Jim Garrison is showing a very clear understanding of the case. That Oswald's role in New Orleans was to be, as he put it, Cuba-fied, handing out the Fair Play for Cuba committee. He was being sheep-dipped. Of course, he's right absolutely about the shots having come from the front as well as from the back. In fact, the Parkland physicians were very clear about his having been shot in the right temple, creating that blowout at the back of his head, the fist-sized blowout, but also having been shot in the throat from in front, where Malcolm Ferry 3 times during the Parkland press conference held after he and the director of neurology had announced that JFK was dead, that he'd been shot in the throat. So, you know, he's been very accurate here about finding the best sources on the medical evidence, the Parkland physician, which has remained the case to this very day, and about Oswald's role, being sheep-dipped in New Orleans to play the role of the patsy so that aspersions could be cast on Castro and indirectly on the Soviet Union. And I particularly like that Steve Allen took this survey of his audience to see what percentage believed that the Warren Commission had fallen short and what percentage thought that it was more or less intact and whole. It makes my admiration for Steve Allen grow enormously. I had in the past been a fan of Johnny Carson, but you know, after his brutal treatment of Jim Garrison, his dereliction of his responsibility to the American people, my opinion of Johnny Carson has dropped precipitously, and I'm very impressed with the way Steve Allen handled this.
This is 1971, Dr. Fetzer, and by the way, he was not really talking to the Senator Russell Long. He was talking about Hale Boggs, who was actually on the Warren Commission, so he actually held that secret for a very long time. And that applause was very, very telling. That was about 250 to 4, but as you were mentioning with Johnny Carson, it's not going to be so easy this time because they've sent in a felon, and we're going to see exactly what he does because he's been silent up to this point, but trust me, he's about to really start pouring it on.
Talking about B1 Bob Dornan, who was a congressman from California, right-winger, And I could tell he was trying to intrude there. No, the observations he was making about David Ferry were, of course, historic. I mean, they were well featured in Oliver Stone's film JFK, where David Ferry claimed that he'd driven all the way through Texas in this horrible weather to go ice skating, which was obviously a manifest absurdity. And Garrison is, of course, talking about his book on the trail of the assassins, which happens to be my wife's favorite book about JFK. So he must have spoken both with Senator Long, but also with the Congressman Hale Boggs, Gary, because when he talks here about Senator Long, I believe he is speaking about Senator Long, and if he also had conversations with Hale Boggs. I mean, I know Hale Boggs was unsatisfied with the situation, but there was a reconstruction of a conversation with Senator Long in Oliver Stone's film. So I'm confident that had historic roots.
Well, what do you think about the Dallas FBI saying there was no need to investigate David Ferry, an associate of Lee Oswald?
Yeah, it's all predictable. I mean, of course, they're involved in the cover-up. They don't want to hear anything about it. So when they're basically boxed in by Jim Garrison to discuss it, they're gonna treat it in the most perfunctory, exculpatory fashion possible by allowing David Ferry to tell his own story. And then they're simply going to accept it, without any investigation, questioning whatsoever. So I think this is all very, very interesting and very, very good, setting things up for...
all right, so we're going on to...
Yeah,
we're going on to Commander Humes now. So here we go. We'll back it up just a hair.
Well, then we jump, appropriately enough, though, it'd be about time, we jump to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The government succeeded in accomplishing what normally would not be able to accomplish in another city. Succeeded in getting the body of the president out of Dallas without an autopsy. In other words, Air Force One, as I pointed out in the book, didn't so much take off as it made a getaway. And along with Lyndon Johnson, the new president, who had taken his oath of office as soon as possible because the country was in great danger, he thought. Of course, immediately after the oath, the danger seemed to subside. But meanwhile, the plane took off with the body of the president, and no civilian autopsy had been conducted. Then the body was placed in a controlled environment, the military hospital of Bethesda, and there the autopsy was conducted. After the autopsy, Commander Humes, who conducted the autopsy, burned his notes, which is probably the first time in history that a serious autopsy resulted in the burning of the notes. Furthermore, the autopsy at Bethesda never was completed, because we found out, and one of the curious things about this was so many things like this we were able to bring out at the trial, that we were pleased with the outcome and thought we had accomplished things and that hadn't been known before. We found none of this came out in the media, for example, for most of you to know. But we found out in a trial, by cross-examining, questioning one of the pathologists, that the autopsy was not completed because a general appeared and ordered them not to examine the wound in the neck because it was an entrance wound in the front, and the bullet had not come out of the back.
And he was not a physician.
The general?
The general.
No, he was not a physician, but he was a general, which apparently is more important.
Which brings us to the uses of power.
Yes.
And at the moment brings us to a commercial. We'll be right back.
All right, Dr. Spencer, talk to us on that one.
Well, I mean, Garrison's right on top of it, and the fact is that it was, I think his name was Wayland, who was in charge of the military district for the District of Columbia, who may have made that instruction that the throat will not be dissected. In fact, Bob Livingston, world authority on the human brain, is the scientific director of the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Blindness at the National Institute of Health across the street from Bethesda Naval Hospital. It actually called Commander Humes and explained to him how, from the reports on the radio that day, it was evident that JFK had been shot in the throat from in front, that it was a small, clean puncture wound, just as Malcolm Ferry described 3 different times during the Parkland press conference, and therefore explained to Humes that it was terribly important to dissect the neck because, and this is so ironic in retrospect, if there were any evidence of shots from behind, then there had to have been at least 2 shooters and therefore a conspiracy. Humes, of course, we know today, was involved in mucking up the neck wound from a small, clean puncture wound, an obvious wound of entry, to a kind of a gaudy-looking thing, where Bob Livingston told me how Humes had actually called him in the evening to ask what the throat wound would look like had it been a wound of exit. And it appears that Humes used what Livingston told him about how it ought to have looked, where he was an expert on wound ballistics from having supervised an emergency medical hospital for injured Okinawans and Japanese prisoners of war during the Battle of Okinawa. But even more stunningly, of course, we now know today, because of the diligent work of Douglas Horn and the Assassination Records Review Board, that Humes actually took a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and greatly enlarged the wound to the back from a fist-sized blowout to virtually the whole back and much of the top of his head, to make it resemble something that would have been more like the result of a shot fired from behind. But where, when the ARRB deposed Thomas Evan Robinson, who was the mortician who prepared the body for a funeral and who spent more time with the body than any other human being, was asked about a diagram that J. Thornton Boswell had drawn with some dotted lines, he explained, "Oh no, the doctors did that." Where he'd observed this along with Ed Reed, who was a technician at the Bethesda Hospital. Humes was so arrogant, he actually performed this surgery to the head, where David Lifton brilliantly picked up on it from the Siebert and O'Neill report when there was mention of surgery to the head. By Humes, who I think was too clever by half. Where Humes is not really that smart a guy. And he put his foot in it big time, and Lifton was astute enough to pick up on it. But everything Garrison is saying is absolutely right. And what Dornan is doing, obviously, in introducing Humes, is wanting to go to the official Bethesda autopsy report. But, you know, Garrison's not letting him get away with it, Gary.
Well, he's just getting cranked up. Here we go.
Bob, I was just noticing as I was getting set to bring you out a story from Time magazine back in 1966. I'll just quote briefly and get your comment on that to start off with.
What month?
November 11, 1966. For many who believe that there was a conspiracy to assassinate John Kennedy, the most mesmeric argument of all is that an extraordinary number of people involved in the case, however remotely, have since lost their lives under mysterious circumstances. As of last week, and this again was 1966, the total had reached 14. It may now have, the number may have gone higher. Does that seem to you a fact of any significance?
Well, I think, Steve, that it's just one of those quirks of fate that would be similar to the strange circumstances surrounding the parallel between Lee Harvey Oswald and John Wilkes Booth, and Kennedy's secretary being named Lincoln and Lincoln's secretary being named Kennedy, and the fact that they were both shot in the presence of their wife in the back of the head. It's almost like the unbelievable Shakespearean situation that both Kennedy brothers were shot in the back of their heads in front of their wives. And who would have ever dreamed that two political figures of their importance could ever be killed?
Although Sirhan fired from the front, which was quite a trick. But well, no interruption.
No, if you've seen, fortunately, with the Sirhan case, we have Rosie Greer and George Plimpton and many, many eyewitnesses that pounced right on the man. Now, if Sirhan had somehow or other miraculously escaped, I'm sure that he would be worked into Garrison's book, and that Sirhan would be accused of being a right-wing Arab financed by Texas Oil, who was a close friend of Lee Harvey Oswald. Fortunately, we had him. Now, let me just say, in summing up what I've listened to, Steve, that I think that this is indicative of a national madness that's going on in our country today. That Lieutenant Calley, convicted of mass murder, 22 people, that he would be glorified across this country, that we would see a congressman suggest that he should address a joint session of Congress is national insanity. And I think that the way people are looking for conspiracies today, whether it's Sirhan Bashar Sirhan or Lee Harvey Oswald, is absolutely insane. I'd like to ask Mr. Garrison one direct, specific question, several specific questions, but the primary one is, Jim Garrison, who blew 13 centimeters out of the skull of President John F. Kennedy?
Well, I was on another point when you came in, so all I can say is I don't find that particularly relevant at the moment. I'd rather pick up on your comment of the number of people
Jim,
killed.
you wipe yourself out when you do that. I
know
it's
that,
phony.
but would you let me wipe myself out, though?
But why can't you answer? Why can't you say who you think did it? Not by name, but by, say, grouping.
But
did
I want to wipe myself out
do it?
first by replying to your initial statement of the number of people being killed. These deaths were not necessarily meaningless because they included, for example, the death of a man named Kerthy, who was a close associate of Jack Ruby's, and his death was diagnosed by the coroner as suicide by throwing himself through a plate glass window. And we had one death after the other like that, and it's really not just as irrelevant as my friend makes it seem. There were too many deaths, and they immediately followed the assassination and eliminated a number of important witnesses. And that's the point I wanted to get across. Now, I'll be glad to answer any other questions you have.
David Ferry was one of those who is now dead.
David Ferry is one of the most important witnesses, and he is dead after two suicide notes, which were signature, of course, was typed.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, what about suspicious death?
Well, it's more important that Dornan obviously has a script. He's trying to smear Garrison. He's trying to throw everything but the kitchen sink in there. He's bringing up Lieutenant Calley. I mean, we had this atrocity in Vietnam. He was one of the few that was exposed, but as John Kerry, when he was a decent human being, testified to Congress. There were many actions like that in Vietnam, and there's no good reason in the world why B1 Bomber Bob ought to be bringing this up, except that he's trying to create this sense that there's some kind of national loss of sanity, which is frankly quite absurd. To me, listening to Dornan is a very disgusting experience. He's clearly a shill for the CIA here. He's been well prepared to try to come and paint Garrison in the broadest strokes as though he had lost his way, when Garrison, in fact, is the most intelligent and responsible public official in the United States at that time. And in fact, by comparison, in many ways, since the death of JFK, there are, of course, we know today, around 100 strange deaths. And the fact of the matter is, Garrison's staying right on top. All these deaths were very suspicious. Richard Belzer has written a new book about JFK, The Dead Witnesses, is more detailed and thorough, but there are quite a host of them. And you know, the Dornan is trying to play this up and suggest, oh, it was just a circumstance like Kennedy having a secretary named Lincoln and Lincoln a secretary named Kennedy, and that they were both shot. Notice how he starts talking about shot in the back of the head when we'd already been established by Garrison that he'd been shot in the right temple. Though they're not talking about the throat wound, we have that in addition. So it's Dornan trying to play a sleight of hand here, which I find completely and utterly despicable.
You know, Dr. Fetzer, it's possible that was Mort Saul that said the JFK coincidences with Lincoln.
Oh, it may have been Mort Saul. Yeah, I'm not looking at the video, so I'm not seeing that there's a third party there. Yeah,
right.
Mort Saul is a pretty good guy, but Dornan is not. So let's hear more about it from Jim.
Yeah, sometimes it's a little difficult because it's only audio. This Pat Valentino that actually recorded this with a tape recorder, I believe, right off the television, and it's very rare. There has been some work on it, but I just really felt it was worth listening to. So,
oh yeah, I agree, Gary. Let's go with it.
All right, here we go.
Another segment.
I wanted to get across. Now, I'll be glad to answer any other questions you have.
David Ferry was one of those who is now dead.
David Ferry is one of the most important witnesses, and he is dead after 2 suicide notes, which were, signature, of course, was typed.
But, Jim, by strong innuendo, you're saying that Lee Harvey Oswald somehow or other was working for, and this is the gist I get out of every time Mort appears or you appear, was killed somehow or other by right-wing, war-mongering, military, industrial, capitalist, pro-Lyndon Johnson extremists.
I have no idea where you reached this conclusion.
Well, you say
I make rather clear in the book we're talking about that Lee Harvey Oswald was a young employee of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he was killed by Jack Ruby, who also was employed by the Central Intelligence.
Right, now there, Jim. There is where your case totally unravels into a position of, I feel, idiocy.
Why?
Here is a pathetic, nebbish man sticking his finger in light sockets in his cell.
Who's that?
Jack Ruby, standing on the edge of his bunk, falling on his head, trying to kill himself by bumping himself on the head, screaming that they're torturing Jews outside. The idiocy of Warren going into the cell alone and not tape recording the interview, I grant you, is ridiculous. But if this country has to choose between Earl Warren and Jim Garrison, I think that's indicative of the plight that we're in.
Well, I think that the people have indicated their choice already by the applause at the beginning of the program.
Well, maybe
they question the conclusions of the Warren report.
Well, we also see people cheering for a man that shot little women and kids at 5 feet from the point of his gun and suggesting that he be made a hero. If you took a listing of the 2.5 million men that have served in Vietnam and tried to pick out of that list that would stretch for miles, trying to pick out a man to address a joint session of Congress, Khaled would be number on the bottom, or third from the bottom, second from the bottom. He'd want to be the last one.
Well, what would Warren address?
This fella's out of control.
You get a lot of double talk from Bob Dornan, who clearly has been instructed to try to ridicule Jim Garrison as often and as strongly as possible. And as I observed before, it's despicable behavior. These are unsupportable smears. He's trying to put words in Garrison's mouth. Garrison's emphasizing the role of the CIA. Ironically, as I was listening to his characterization of the right-wing capitalists, Texas Oilman and all that, actually, that is
he was
not
right.
a bad collective description of the sponsors of the assassination.
Yeah.
So, I think in the end, we don't get any clarity in disentangling how it can be most adequately understood until we distinguish between the sponsors, the individuals or groups who wanted JFK out and Lyndon in, the mechanics, the actual shooters on the ground, their supervisors and coordinators, and the facilitators who were Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar. So, Dornan's doing his best to confound the public, but, Garrison's a very calm, deliberate person, Gary, and I don't think...
Well, what do you think
Dornan
about him becoming the future mayor of Los Angeles and also a congressman and also a presidential candidate against Bill Clinton? I mean, do you think he's warming up?
Gary, if you carry heavy water for the government, for the hidden government, the Central Intelligence Agency in particular, you can receive many benefits. It's people like Jim Garrison who speak the truth and don't kowtow and seek to play the game that the powers would prefer that he play, that are harmed or the subject of targets of ridicule like this. So Dornan is disgusting. You get paid off for it, but that doesn't make anything he's saying here either true or appropriate. Yeah, except there are some ironies attached to his description there.
Yeah. All right, here we go.
I know, we're under the gun here, if you'll forgive the term. The Warren report, as much as I like it, in fact, I really like it. I've left many girls falling asleep waiting for me to finish the Warren report. But, the Warren report is largely what didn't happen, and I'd like to talk about what did happen. And I'm interested, very selfishly, as an American in what the results are in the living values in this country since the death of Jack Kennedy, because I think he was removed for a reason. Can we discuss that? Sure.
Mort, I would agree with you that President Kennedy's death was the biggest watershed in our lifetime of history.
Watershed?
It's just a dividing point in the life of our country. It's totally changed the whole mood of this nation, and it's been crazy ever since.
And its foreign policy.
All right, now let me ask you about liberal intellectuals today, and I know that term sort of jolts you right away. They haven't been kind to you. That are taking John F. Kennedy's inaugural address,
yes,
and calling it, you know this, Steve, a warlike bellicose document. And I'll paraphrase just one line. Let every nation know, whether it is friend or foe, that we will pay any price, bear any burden, suffer any hardship to ensure the success and the survival of liberty. Now, they say this was a warlike document.
I'm glad you asked that question, Bob.
Okay.
Because the answer is in Heritage of Stone. That's a very common device of the Central Intelligence Agency to discredit President Kennedy so that we won't miss him as much. That's one of their...
These are intellectuals.
Yes, would you, Doc?
Yeah, I just want to point out that that's Morton Saul.
Yeah. Mark Saul's doing some good things here, and Dornan's having difficulty coping with it. And no one at the time regarded what JFK was saying as bellicose. He was affirming that he was going to be a strong president with regard to foreign policy and national security issues, which most Republicans had regarded as his weakness and the reason why they preferred Richard Nixon. So it was a fine statement. Ted Sorensen, of course, was JFK's speechwriter. He authored many magnificent speeches for JFK, who delivered them very well, and most certainly Mort Saul is correct that Dornan should not be faulting JFK for what was in fact a very appropriate speech, especially in the middle of the Cold War.
I'll read some of the later comments of President Kennedy, what he really said, because his death is significant, not so much because...
he didn't say that at the inauguration?
What he really said later on, in 1963, I'm trying to get to a more relevant time.
You mean to Kenny O'Donnell privately in a hotel room?
Well, that's one of many comments by 1963. Things have changed since the inauguration. But the important thing about the Kennedy assassination was that it opened the way for the invasion by America of Southeast Asia. Because prior to Kennedy's death, we had no combat troops in Southeast Asia.
What do you call 17,000 Green Berets?
Well, now, we call them advisors. Everyone was an advisor, and many people don't know it, but an advisor actually is a standard position in the Army. Kennedy, to the day of his death, refused to send a single combat soldier over. And let me give you an example.
Are you aware the Green Berets got the combat infantry?
You don't mind if I finish a sentence, do you?
But no, Joe, of course not.
Thank you very much. Now, here's one of... Here's a comment by John Kennedy in late 1963 about the insistence of the military in sending more troops into South Vietnam. They want a force of American troops, he told me early in November. This is Schlesinger. They say it's necessary in order to restore confidence and maintain morale. But it will be just like Berlin. The troops will march in. The bands will play. The crowds will cheer. And in 4 days, everyone will have forgotten. Then we will be told we'll have to send in more troops. It's like taking a drink. The effect wears off, and you have to take another. The war in Vietnam, he added, could be won only so long as it was their war. If it were ever converted into a white man's war, we would lose as the French had lost a decade earlier. And these are the comments that John Kennedy was making in 1963.
Very appropriate. Jim Garrison's doing an excellent job here, and obviously the audience is not impressed with Dornan. So I think this is a very fine performance by Jim Garrison, and Mort Saul clearly has his heart in the right place, but Garrison is carrying the burden of the argument.
Yeah, he paid a heavy price for this, Mr. Saul, because he was blacklisted for actually being on the Jim Garrison investigation team. He actually wrote jokes for John Kennedy, so he really dearly loved the man. Was profoundly distraught when this had happened. He really wanted to know what happened. He paid a price for it.
And I'm not talking about his inauguration comments, but 1963. And as a result, a tremendous rift developed between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA on one hand, and John Kennedy on the other, because up to the day of his death, he refused to send a single combat soldier into Vietnam. However, after his death, more than 500,000 combat soldiers were sent into Vietnam. Now that's the significance of John Kennedy's death. Not that it was a watershed, but it opened the way to send 500,000 American troops into Southeast Asia.
All right, now, Jim, your sincerity in this is obvious, and God knows so is Mort's. He's hurt himself financially as much as any performer because of what I always felt was grievously feeling the death of John Kennedy as though he'd lost a literal brother. Lost the country. And I don't question the sincerity either of you. What I do question is this attempt to lay the blame at the feet of the very men who have been bloodied and died in, granted, a political war. Now, John F. Kennedy, before his election, and he was only president for 2 years and 10 months, made the case of the missile gap. It turned out to be a fiction. But by appointing Robert McNamara and taking his advice from Schlesinger and Galbraith and Sorensen and Rostow and McGeorge Bundy, he brought us closer to the point of nuclear warfare than any president maybe ever will. On October 22nd, 62, a ship coincidentally named after his brother, there's more of that fate, the Joseph P. Kennedy, challenged the Russian ship on the high seas. And I was sitting right over here on a stage at Paramount when Kennedy told us that we're going to go to nuclear war if they don't turn those missiles around. Just the year before that, wait a minute, Mort, the year before that, Kennedy, on his order, sent in RUDT men, sent in 1,250 Cubans in our uniforms with our guns and our landing boats, and then denied them air cover, put them on the beach, ransomed them out, stood in the arena in Miami and said, I hold the flag of the 2506 Brigade, and it will fly again over a free Cuba. He was dedicated to containing communism, but the mistake Kennedy made was through Maxwell Taylor, he built up limited warfare. He created air commando units in the Air Force. I visited that. He, to this day, has assigned the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg. He brought the Green Berets back into existence from the small Devil Brigade.
To put his name on arms. He didn't put his name.
But he recreated the Green Berets.
He created that?
He brought them back into existence.
Now I want to give you a figure, Bob, that's going to shake you up.
Okay.
During the 3 years that Jack Kennedy led you, 137 men died in Vietnam. That's a good week under Nixon.
Man, this Dornan's a shield of the highest order.
Well, he is, Gary, and in fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis was brilliantly managed by JFK and Bobby. I fear you and I wouldn't be having this conversation today if Richard Nixon had been president or if the views of B1 Bob had prevailed. This is a retrospective fallacy. We were navigating through the most complex confrontation between the two world superpower imaginable, and we came through in one piece. And for Dornan to be attempting to pervert it, demonstrate the depth to which he had been trained to deliver this misconceived attack on JFK, trying to not only smear Jim Garrison, but to tarnish John F. Kennedy's reputation, where, just as Mort Saul observed, so that we would not care as much about his loss. It's a terrible thing he's doing here, and I'm glad we're discussing it.
Yeah, I'm having a lot more respect from Mort Saul, that's for sure.
137 in 3 years? What are we talking about?
No, wait a minute. No, proceed. No, that factor is frightening to me because I recall debating George Lincoln Rockwell on the stage where you used to do your show across the street. And on Halloween, when I debated him, or at the end of '64, a year after Kennedy was dead, it was still only 251. 251 men killed in combat in Vietnam. But the liberal advisors, the McNamara's, heading the World Bank now, the McGeorge Bundys, the Clark Cliffords, they were the ones that recommended to his successor that we bomb the North, that we put in ground troops, and I agree with you that it was madness to put non-volunteer kids, drafted kids, into an undeclared war when a liberal media is saying it's immoral.
No,
the President Oker saying it's better to run away to sleep.
That's not
The president did not go along.
That's not
why,
correct.
You know, if you know anything about Jesus, it's very kind. That's why he was killed.
But more, didn't John Kennedy recreate the Green Berets?
No, but just a minute.
Didn't he create
Fight on the side, not on that side, on the other side.
to fight for the Viet Cong?
No, it's Cesar Chavez, not what the... Oh, man.
John Kennedy created the Green Berets to fight in our vineyards. No, he
To
created...
help the people free
More,
themselves.
he sent Green Berets to every country
He
in South
also created
America.
the Alliance for Progress.
And the Peace Corps.
We'll return to the wars in just a moment.
Well, it's just despicable what Dornan is doing here. You know, it's called special pleading. You try to find those aspects of the case that you can criticize and ignore everything else. That's why it was beautiful to talk about the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps. Yeah, JFK revived the Green Berets, but that I don't even myself today regard that as having been a bad thing. What I see as a bad thing is Dornan abusing his position here for clear political purposes, and you can tell how often he resorts to stereotypes about the liberal press. The United States has never had a liberal press, and it's a propaganda position that's advocated by conservatives because they just think the press isn't conservative enough. And Dornan was a John Birch Society guy all the way, and there's no doubt that, you know, a moderate or reasonable press would, in his eyes, be a liberal press, which is just one of many forms of distortion that he's promoting here on this program.
Bob, I want to get back briefly to a point you raised before. It may seem to some irrelevant to bring up the Cali matter when we're discussing the Kennedy assassination, but then there are sentences in which the two have a relationship in regards
Not
to...
in your book, is it, Jim? The Cali thing at all?
I don't think it has much to do with what we're talking about at all.
I just wanted to, therefore, to dispose of that side issue by asking one brief question. You mentioned earlier, and I agree with you, Bob, that the motivations of people to whom Cali is a hero are, at the very least, a mystery to me, and I'm shocked by that. Do you think that these people who are making all these strong, gung-ho, pro-Cali statements are of the political left or the political right?
They are the American confused majority composed of both segments. And I'll tell you an experience that I've had several experiences in the last 10 days, Steve, it just knocks me out. I've had 4 speeches in the last 2 weeks that were to generally conservative or middle-of-the-road audiences. In one I walked into, 300 people were for Cali. And I don't want this to sound like an ego trip, but in 10 minutes I had turned around every one of the 300 people. They just haven't analyzed it, and what they're expressing is an anger at a mass media that has picked up on Me Lie and regurgitated it ad nauseum and beat us all collectively over the heads with it, and has never discussed the mass atrocities that dwarf Me Lie. The 4,700 people slaughtered at Way. I know Mort likes to work with a newspaper, so I brought one up. The story of Sergeant Fritz, cut 1,000 times all over his body in the I-core area so that the skin just literally hung off his body. These stories aren't reported on but once, and then they're forgotten. Last week, 200 people killed in the little village of Duck Duck by the Viet Cong. Civilians slaughtered. It's forgotten within 10 hours. And that's what people respond to.
The media is not responsible, you will find, upon investigation. And investigation is terrific, because evidentiary material is good exercise if nothing else, and it's a lot else. Me Lie was given as an octopus for General Abrams and his United States Army to wrestle with because he told the Green Berets to stop being an SS in the American Army, which is not in the American tradition, and not to do side jobs for the CIA, or should I say main jobs for the CIA and side jobs for the Army.
I thought you said the Green Berets were formed to fight in the vineyards with Cesar Chavez.
The Green Berets were formed by John Kennedy to help people find their freedom, and that was changed by the people who kill a president. And the pregnant question is,
Why do we kill a president? Who does it? And what do they gain from it?
I'd like to get Jim Garrison's comment on that question.
Yes. Now, this is what I'd like to get back to, because my book is not only about the death of John Kennedy, but how we got into Vietnam. The decision to change John Kennedy's opposition to sending combat troops into Vietnam was made on Sunday, 48 hours after his death, by Lyndon Johnson.
Who advised him? Who advised Lyndon?
May I finish my sentence?
But, Jim, the man couldn't speak without pulling a political pole out of his
You
pocket.
let me finish my sentence, then we can go into your question. Lyndon Johnson met in Washington after the eulogy for John Kennedy, while John Kennedy's body was still on the catafalque, and met with Henry Cabot Lodge, the ambassador to Vietnam. And you'll find this in a book by Tom Wicker of the New York Times called LBJ and JFK. And at that meeting, Lyndon Johnson said, you go back to Vietnam and tell them that we're going to back them up all the way. And that's when the change occurred. From then on, the troops began to pour overseas into Southeast Asia until there were 547,000, not under John Kennedy, but under Lyndon Johnson. But since then, again and again, one of the most effective things the government has done to confuse the American people is to try and create the impression that somehow John Kennedy had something to do with the tremendous buildup in Vietnam. Actually, Kennedy had issued orders to McNamara, and it's a matter of record, and it's indicated here in the appendix of my book, and supported by facts, that all American troops were to be removed from Vietnam by 1965. And in order to leave no doubt about that, he ordered McNamara to make that statement from the steps of the White House. And Schlesinger adds that he was sitting there at the time, that as McNamara went out to meet the press with Maxwell Taylor to tell them that we were going to have all troops out of Vietnam by 1965, John Kennedy hollered, and tell him that means the helicopters and the helicopter pilots too, because he was bringing the troops back from Southeast Asia and withdrawing. It was by killing him that the way was opened by the military to get into Vietnam and Southeast Asia.
Jim, your sentences are so long. It's like Victor Hugo writing 8 pages without a period.
Have you read my book?
This Dornan filled. It'd be a course in fallacies, don't you think, Dr. Fetzer?
Dornan's a despicable person. He was even censured by the House of Representatives. He was very upset when he was unseated by a Latino in his seat in Garden Grove, California, in Orange County, which was the most conservative county in the United States at the time. And, you know, it's just, Garrison was making many, many important points, and he's talking here about National Security Action Memorandum 263, which required that all those troops be pulled out, even the helicopters and the helicopter pilots, by 1965, and where Lyndon reversed it with National Security Action Memorandum 273, which others have observed appears to have been prepared for his signature before JFK had been taken out in Dallas.
Yeah, well, he's about to shill for Lyndon Johnson big time.
No, and I promise I will, Jim.
Well, that's
But Jim, let me tell you something. You're telling the American public that within 48 hours, Lyndon Johnson, who inherited Kennedy's entire staff, the Kennedy clique that loved him, Kenny O'Donnell, he kept Pierre Salinger till Salinger asked out, McBundy, Rostow, McNamara, all of these guys suddenly turned on Kennedy, became hawks overnight.
Precisely.
And today McNamara quietly sits skiing at Aspen in his beautiful lodge that hangs off a cliff at Snowmass with men that he sent into combat, rotting in prison camps into their 6th and 7th and 8th years, and will not answer you when you say that, like some sort of traitorous fink, he turned on his friend before he was cold in the grave and started madly sending troops into Vietnam because the right wing that hates Kennedy's McNamara's guts wanted troops in there for oil reasons.
Just a minute. Just a minute. I'm talking about facts.
No, you're not, Jim. You're talking about incredible speculation. There's not one historian of credential that will back up one thing you've just said.
Well, I just gave you...
Friend, he will. I don't think he will. I wish we could get that.
I just gave you the name of one of the experts in foreign affairs in the United States who makes the point about when this decision was made by Lyndon Johnson within 48 hours after the assassination. Tom Wicker of the New York Times tells about the meeting.
And at that
in the
time,
old Senate office
and
building.
at that time, 8 years ago, Tom was about 26 years old. Now look, Jim.
He's saying that Tom Wicker was 27 years old at the time, like he was just a kid.
Honestly, if you believe this, why didn't McNamara bomb the MiG bases, and then when he finally did, why did he let the MiGs fly to China?
Why didn't he blockade Haiphong? Why didn't he hit the good 40 feet high on the dot?
Stop with the tactical...
Why did we fight a no-win war?
Why are you surprised, Robert K. Dornan, that men defer to power? Why are you surprised that they defer to power?
Obviously, this power corrupted Johnson and the rest. But I don't think that they deliberately sent American kids to die because of some conspiracy. The best thing to sum it up...
How did they get over that?
Listen, as human as it sounds, as human as it sounds...
Well, Gary, yes, I mean, Dornan's throwing in every possible right-wing plot or plan for how to defeat the Vietnamese on the assumption that the war was going forward. He was talking about not bombing the MiG bases and all this other stuff. It's complete rubbish. JFK was getting us out. And Dornan's talking about why didn't he do a whole host of aggressive actions if we had stayed in. He was going to spare the United States a loss of 50,000 young Americans and 2 million Vietnamese who died during the conflict that was brought to us by Lyndon Johnson and the powerful forces supporting him, which was one of the most important reasons that JFK was taken out. It's just a disgusting situation here that Dornan should be so abusing history, and it was very cleverly scripted for Dornan. He's adhering to a script that was written for him by the CIA.
Well, he was openly in military intelligence. It has to be the case or in any of these stories that we ever cover. All right, Dr. Fetzer, and we'll talk to you on the next time.
Great, Gary. Great. Terrific. Good work.
All right, we'll talk to you soon, Dr. Fetzer.